Who let her in here? The voice rang through the grand ballroom with such sharp confidence that conversation stopped almost instantly. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead. Hundreds of guests turned toward the center of the room. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. Laughter faded. Even the string quartet playing near the stage seemed quieter for a moment. Corinne Whitlock stood alone beneath a canopy of golden light as every eye in the ballroom found her. The room itself was magnificent. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Manhattan skyline. Silver and gold decorations reflected across polished marble floors. Some of the most influential business leaders in America filled the tables surrounding the stage. It was the annual Hale Global Leadership Gala, one of the most exclusive corporate events in the country. Invitations were coveted. Attendance was limited. Reputation mattered. And at that moment, the attention of the entire room belonged to a woman many people believed did not belong there. Audrey Kensington lowered the microphone slightly and stared at Corinne from the stage. The executive director's expression remained composed, but her irritation was visible. "I asked a question," she said. "Who authorized her access to this event?" Murmurs immediately spread across nearby tables. Guests glanced at one another. Some looked confused. Others looked amused. A few openly examined Corinne from head to toe as though trying to determine how she had entered the ballroom. Corinne remained still. Her dark navy evening dress was elegant but understated compared to many of the extravagant designer gowns around her. She wore no jewelry intended to attract attention. No entourage followed her. Nothing about her appearance announced wealth or influence. Yet there was something undeniably composed about the way she stood beneath the chandelier light. Audrey stepped down from the stage. The click of her heels echoed across the marble floor as she approached. "Ma'am," she said loudly enough for surrounding tables to hear. "This section is reserved for invited guests." Corinne met her gaze calmly. "I understand." Audrey folded her arms. "Then perhaps you understand why this situation is unusual." A few nearby guests laughed softly. Corinne heard them. She showed no reaction. The orchestra continued playing in the background. Beyond the windows, thousands of city lights sparkled against the night sky. Everything about the evening radiated prestige. Everything except the growing tension surrounding the woman standing alone. Audrey looked toward event staff. "Please verify her credentials." Two employees approached carrying tablets. They searched databases, checked registration records, compared names. The longer they searched, the more uncomfortable they seemed. Finally, one of them looked up. "I cannot locate her information." Audrey nodded as though she expected exactly that result. "That is what I thought." More whispers spread through the ballroom. Corinne glanced briefly toward the skyline outside. The city looked peaceful from 40 stories above the streets. Audrey took another step forward. "This event is private." Corinne smiled politely. "I am aware." "Then perhaps you should explain why you are here." The question hung in the air. Guests leaned forward in their chairs. Some expected an argument. Others expected embarrassment. Instead, Corinne simply looked at Audrey and answered with surprising calm. "I was invited." The response triggered another wave of quiet laughter. Audrey smiled thinly. "Apparently not." Across the room, several senior executives exchanged strange glances. One older board member narrowed his eyes as he studied Corinne more carefully. Another seemed to recognize something but could not quite place it. The reactions were subtle, almost invisible. Yet they marked the first crack in the certainty filling the room. Corinne noticed none of it. She remained exactly where she was, calm beneath the golden light while hundreds of strangers formed opinions about her. And somewhere far below the ballroom, an elevator was rising toward the top floor carrying a man whose arrival would soon change everything everyone believed they understood about the woman standing alone in the center of the room. The silence that followed Corinne Whitlock's answer seemed to stretch across the entire ballroom. "I was invited." The simple statement should have ended the conversation. Instead, it appeared to make Audrey Kensington even more determined. Around them, the annual gala continued in fragments. Servers moved carefully between tables carrying sparkling water and plated dinners. The string quartet resumed its performance. Yet nobody seemed fully focused on the event anymore. Attention remained fixed on the woman standing beneath the chandelier light. Audrey glanced toward the event staff holding tablets. Search again. The employees complied immediately. Names scrolled across screens. Registration lists appeared and disappeared. One employee checked the VIP database. Another searched sponsor records. Neither found anything. Their discomfort grew more obvious with every passing second. Finally, one of them shook his head. There is still no match. Audrey looked toward the surrounding guests as though the result confirmed everything she already believed. Then we have our answer. Soft whispers spread through nearby tables. Corinne heard fragments of them. Questions. Assumptions. Speculation. Someone suggested she had entered through a service entrance. Another guessed she was accompanying a guest who had already left. A third wondered whether she had mistaken the event for something else. None of them spoke directly to her. They simply discussed her as though she were not standing 3 feet away. Corinne remained calm. The city lights beyond the windows reflected softly across the polished floor. She folded her hands in front of her and waited. Not because she felt powerless. Not because she enjoyed the attention. Simply because she refused to become the kind of person the crowd expected her to be. Audrey stepped closer. This evening represents decades of achievement, she said. People in this room earned the right to be here. The implication was unmistakable. Several guests nodded. Others avoided eye contact. Corinne met Audrey's gaze. I am sure many of them did. Something about the answer unsettled Audrey. There was no anger in it. No defensiveness. No attempt to prove anything. Just quiet confidence. Across the ballroom, an elderly man seated near the back slowly lowered his glass. Harold Bennett had attended every Hale Global gala since the company was founded. At 71 years old, he had watched entire industries rise and fall. Very little surprised him anymore. Yet as he studied Corinne from across the room, uncertainty crossed his face. There was something familiar about her. Something he could not immediately place. Meanwhile, Audrey continued pressing forward. If you were invited, who invited you? The room seemed to lean toward the answer. Corinne glanced briefly toward the ballroom entrance. Then back toward Audrey. The same person who invited everyone else. A few guests laughed. Audrey did not. The response felt less like a joke and more like a statement she did not fully understand. Before she could respond, one of the senior executives near the stage quietly approached another board member. They exchanged a few words. Both looked toward Corinne. Their expressions changed slightly. Recognition? Curiosity? Concern? Nobody could quite tell. The moment passed quickly. Yet it did not go unnoticed. Harold Bennett saw it. So did Audrey. For the first time all evening, a faint crack appeared in her certainty. Corinne noticed none of it. She simply stood beneath the warm glow of crystal light while Manhattan shimmered beyond the windows. The ballroom remained beautiful, elegant, prestigious. Yet beneath all that luxury, something else had begun spreading through the room. Doubt. Because despite the humiliation, despite the whispers, despite the public scrutiny, the woman at the center of the controversy behaved like someone who knew a truth nobody else had discovered yet. And somewhere above the ballroom, a private elevator had just reached the top floor. A subtle shift moved through the ballroom long before anyone understood why. The tension surrounding Corinne Whitlock remained the center of attention, yet something else had begun changing beneath the surface. Guests who had initially laughed now seemed less certain. Conversations grew quieter. Even Audrey Kensington appeared increasingly frustrated by the lack of resolution. She had expected the situation to end quickly. Instead, every minute seemed to deepen the mystery surrounding the woman standing calmly beneath the chandeliers. Corinne had not argued. She had not demanded special treatment. She had not called anyone for help. Somehow that made people more curious than if she had caused a scene. Across the room, Harold Bennett slowly rose from his table. Several nearby guests greeted him respectfully as he moved through the crowd. As one of the original members of Hale Global's founding board, Harold carried a reputation few people in the ballroom could match. His silver hair and measured movements reflected decades of experience. More importantly, people listened when he spoke. Tonight, however, Harold seemed distracted. His attention remained fixed on Corinne. The closer he came, the more unsettled he appeared. Meanwhile, Audrey continued addressing event staff. Double-check every sponsor list, she instructed. every donor list, every executive approval. The staff complied immediately. Screens glowed. Databases opened. Searches continued. Yet the result never changed. Corinne's name remained absent from every system Audrey trusted. Nearby guests interpreted the silence as confirmation. A few whispered comments resurfaced. Some questioned how long the disruption would continue. Others wondered why the woman had not simply left. Corinne heard them all. She turned slightly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. Thousands of lights shimmered against the darkness. Yellow taxis traced distant streets below. The city felt calm from 40 stories above the ground. She focused on that view instead of the opinions surrounding her. Then Harold Bennett finally reached her. He stopped several feet away and studied her face carefully. For a moment neither spoke. Audrey noticed immediately. So did several executives standing nearby. Something about Harold's expression drew attention. It was not suspicion. It was recognition struggling to become certainty. "Excuse me," Harold said quietly. Corinne turned toward him. A faint smile touched her face. "Good evening, Harold." The older man froze. Around them, the ballroom seemed to become even quieter. Audrey frowned. Several guests exchanged surprised glances. Harold blinked once, then twice. "Corinne?" he asked. The way he said her name carried years of memory behind it. Corinne nodded gently. "It has been a while." The older man stared at her in disbelief. "My goodness." He shook his head slowly. "I did not recognize you at first." Nearby executives immediately looked toward one another. They clearly recognized Harold's reaction as important. Audrey stepped forward. "You know her." Harold looked at Audrey as though the question itself was surprising. "Know her?" He laughed softly. "Of course I know her." The answer landed heavily across the room. Guests who had spent the evening assuming Corinne was an outsider suddenly found themselves reconsidering everything. Yet Harold did not explain further. Not yet. Instead, he looked back toward Corinne with genuine warmth. "I never expected to see you here tonight." Corinne smiled. "Neither did I." A few people laughed nervously. Audrey did not. The certainty she had relied on all evening was slipping away faster now. Around the ballroom, curiosity spread like electricity. Who was this woman? Why did a founding board member know her so well? And why did she seem completely unsurprised by any of it? Then, before anyone could ask another question, the doors near the private executive entrance opened. Several senior leaders immediately straightened. Conversation stopped once again. And every person in the ballroom instinctively turned toward the entrance where the owner of Hale Global had finally arrived. The moment Preston Hale stepped into the ballroom, the atmosphere changed. Conversations stopped. Executives straightened their posture. Donors who had spent months hoping for a few minutes of his attention suddenly forgot whatever they had been discussing. The owner of Hale Global rarely attended public events for long. When he appeared, people noticed. Warm light from the chandeliers reflected across the polished floor as Preston entered through the private executive doors. Tall, composed, and carrying the quiet confidence that came from decades of leadership, he acknowledged a few greetings with brief nods. Then something unexpected happened. He did not move toward the stage. He did not greet the board members waiting for him near the front of the room. He did not stop to speak with major investors. Instead, his eyes traveled across the ballroom until they found a single person. Corinne Whitlock. The change in his expression was immediate. The tension in his face disappeared. A genuine smile appeared. Around the room people noticed. Audrey Kensington noticed most of all. Preston began walking forward. Not toward the event organizers. Not toward the executive tables. Directly toward Corinne. Guests instinctively stepped aside as he crossed the ballroom. The string quartet continued playing, but the music now felt distant beneath the growing anticipation. Harold Bennett watched quietly. Several board members exchanged nervous glances. Audrey stood frozen beside the event staff. Her confidence from earlier had completely disappeared. Yet she still did not understand what she was seeing. Preston finally reached Corinne. For a moment the two simply looked at each other. Then he smiled warmly. "There you are." The familiarity in his voice immediately sent another wave of confusion through the crowd. Corinne smiled back. Good evening, Preston. The exchange sounded effortless, comfortable, like two people who had known each other for years. Preston glanced around the ballroom. His eyes moved across the guests, the executives, the event staff, and finally settled on Audrey. He noticed the tension immediately. Did I interrupt something? Nobody answered. The silence itself revealed enough. Preston looked back toward Corinne. Is everything all right? Corinne could have explained what had happened. She could have repeated every comment, every assumption, every public humiliation. Instead, she simply nodded. I am fine. Preston studied her face for a moment. Then he looked toward Harold Bennett. The older man gave a small knowing smile. That was all the confirmation Preston needed. Something important had happened before he arrived. Audrey stepped forward cautiously. Mr. Hale, there appears to have been some confusion regarding guest authorization. Preston raised an eyebrow. Confusion? Audrey nodded. We were unable to locate her registration. Preston glanced toward Corinne, then toward the staff holding tablets, then back toward Audrey. For several seconds he said nothing. The silence made Audrey visibly uncomfortable. Finally Preston spoke. And because of that, you assume she did not belong here? No accusation. No raised voice. Just a question. Yet somehow it felt heavier than any public criticism. Audrey hesitated. Around them, hundreds of guests listened carefully. Preston looked across the ballroom one more time. The room had become completely silent. Then he smiled slightly and shook his head. Interesting. The single word deepened the mystery even further. Guests exchanged puzzled looks. Executives leaned forward. Harold folded his arms and waited. Corinne remained calm beneath the chandelier light. Preston looked toward the stage, then back toward the crowd surrounding them. Seemed he had reached a decision. Whatever uncertainty still existed in the ballroom was about to end. And as Manhattan shimmered beyond the glass walls of the ballroom, every person present sensed that the truth they were about to hear would change the entire evening. For several long seconds nobody moved. Preston Hale stood beside Corinne Whitlock while the ballroom waited for an explanation. Crystal chandeliers cast warm reflections across the marble floor. Beyond the towering windows, Manhattan glittered against the night sky. The city seemed impossibly calm compared to the tension filling the room. Audrey Kensington felt every eye shifting between her and Preston. She had spent the entire evening operating from certainty. Now certainty was gone. Around the ballroom, guests leaned forward in their seats. Executives exchanged uneasy glances. Even the event staff holding registration tablets appeared reluctant to move. Preston looked around the room slowly. His expression remained composed, but there was disappointment behind it. Not anger. Something heavier. I find it fascinating, he finally said, how quickly people decide who belongs somewhere. No one responded. The statement felt directed at everyone. Preston continued. A person walks into a room, and within seconds assumptions begin. His gaze moved briefly toward the crowd. What they wear, who they know, where they sit, whether they appear familiar. The room remained silent. Several guests lowered their eyes. Others shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Corinne stood quietly beside him. The light from the chandeliers reflected softly against her dark navy dress. She had become the center of attention without seeking it. Preston turned toward her. Do you remember our first office? A faint smile appeared on Corinne's face. The one above the hardware store? A few people laughed softly, unsure whether they were hearing correctly. Preston nodded. 800 square feet. Leaking ceiling. One borrowed conference table. Harold Bennett smiled immediately. He remembered. Most people in the ballroom did not. They only knew the global corporation that existed now. They did not know the fragile beginnings. Preston glanced toward the crowd again. Back then, everyone talked about risk. He looked at Corinne. You were the only person talking about possibility. More confusion spread through the ballroom. Audrey stared at them. Several executives exchanged puzzled looks. Corinne simply shook her head lightly. You are remembering selectively. Preston laughed. Maybe. The easy familiarity between them deepened the mystery. Guests who had assumed Corinne was an outsider now found themselves struggling to understand what they were witnessing. Why would the owner of Hale Global be discussing the earliest days of the company with her? Why did Harold Bennett seem completely unsurprised? Why did several older executives suddenly appear nervous? Preston slowly turned toward the stage. The giant screen behind it displayed the company's logo above the words celebrating innovation, leadership, and vision. He looked at the screen for a moment before speaking again. Every year we gather to celebrate success. His voice carried across the ballroom. We celebrate growth. We celebrate leadership. We celebrate the people who built this organization. Several guests nodded automatically. Then Preston looked back toward Corinne. The expression on his face changed. Respect. Gratitude. Something much deeper than professional admiration. The problem, he said quietly, is that sometimes the people who contributed the most are the easiest to overlook. The sentence landed heavily. Harold lowered his gaze. A few board members shifted in their seats. Audrey felt her stomach tighten. The room was beginning to understand that the story everyone believed about Corinne was wrong. Very wrong. Yet nobody knew how wrong. Preston stepped slightly closer to Corinne. The crowd watched every movement. The music had stopped completely now. Hundreds of people stood trapped between curiosity and anticipation. Then Preston looked across the ballroom one final time. There is something all of you should know. The words immediately silenced even the remaining whispers. Corinne remained calm. Harold folded his arms. Audrey stared without blinking. And beneath the golden glow of the chandeliers, the entire room prepared to hear a truth that would instantly transform the woman they thought they understood. The ballroom became so quiet that the faint hum of the city beyond the glass walls seemed louder than before. Preston Hale stood beside Corinne Whitlock, his gaze moving slowly across the crowd. Hundreds of people watched him. Executives. Investors, board members, donors. Many had spent years trying to earn his approval. Yet in that moment, none of them mattered as much as the woman standing beside him. Corinne remained calm beneath the golden chandelier light. Her posture never changed. Her expression never hardened. She simply waited. Preston took a slow breath. Most of you know the story of Hale Global. Several guests nodded. The company had become one of the most respected organizations in the country. Business schools taught case studies about its growth. Industry magazines celebrated its success. Financial networks discussed its influence regularly. Yet Preston's next words immediately challenged that familiar narrative. At least you know the version that appears in magazines. A few uncertain smiles appeared around the room. Preston looked toward the giant screen behind the stage where photographs from the company's history cycled through a presentation. Images of headquarters, awards, expansion announcements, leadership conferences, years of success displayed in polished perfection. Then he pointed toward the screen. What you do not see in those photographs is the person who helped build the foundation beneath everything. The room remained silent. Harold Bennett lowered his eyes briefly, already knowing where this was going. Several longtime executives shifted uncomfortably. Audrey Kensington stared at Preston without blinking. He turned toward Corinne. His voice softened. When Hale Global was struggling to survive, there were only a handful of people who believed we could succeed. Corinne smiled faintly. Those were interesting years. Soft laughter moved through parts of the room. Preston nodded. Interesting is one way to describe them. Then he looked back at the audience. Banks rejected us. Investors walked away. Partnerships collapsed. There were weeks when failure seemed unavoidable. The room listened carefully. Most had never heard Preston speak so personally about the company's earliest years. But every time everyone else saw limitations, she saw possibilities. His hand gestured toward Corinne. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Audrey's expression tightened. Preston continued. Many of the ideas that shaped our growth came from conversations with her. Another wave of silence followed. Executives exchanged stunned looks. The revelation was already larger than anyone expected. Yet Preston was not finished. The leadership principles we still use today were developed with her input. Several of our earliest community initiatives came directly from her vision. Around the ballroom, guests began realizing they had spent the evening judging someone whose influence reached deeper into the company than many senior executives. Preston smiled slightly. The irony is almost unbelievable. He glanced around the room. Tonight, people questioned whether she belonged here. A few guests lowered their heads immediately. Audrey looked toward the floor. No one laughed now. No one whispered. Preston's voice remained calm. The truth is much simpler. He turned fully toward Corinne. There would not be a Hail Global Gala without her. The statement landed like a wave moving through the ballroom. Shock appeared on faces throughout the room. Several people stared openly. Others looked from Preston to Corinne and back again as they struggled to absorb what they had just heard. Corinne seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. She shook her head lightly. "You are giving me too much credit." Preston laughed softly. "For 20 years that has been your response." The crowd watched the exchange in complete silence. Every assumption made earlier in the evening was collapsing. Every judgment, every whisper, every confident conclusion. And standing beneath the warm glow of crystal chandeliers while Manhattan sparkled beyond the windows, Corinne remained exactly who she had been from the beginning. The only difference was that everyone else was finally beginning to see her clearly. The effect was immediate. The ballroom that had been filled with whispers only minutes earlier now stood in complete silence. No one seemed quite sure how to react. Crystal chandeliers continued casting golden reflections across the marble floor, but the atmosphere felt entirely different. The same guests who had questioned Corinne Whitlock's presence were now looking at her, as though they were seeing her for the first time. Yet Corinne herself had not changed at all. She stood exactly where she had been standing before Preston Hale spoke. The difference existed only in the minds of everyone around her. Audrey Kensington felt the weight of that realization more than anyone. She replayed the evening in her mind. Every assumption, every comment, every decision she had made based on appearances rather than facts. Earlier she had felt completely confident. Now she struggled to meet Corinne's eyes. Around the ballroom, several guests appeared equally uncomfortable. Some quietly looked down at their tables. Others stared out the windows toward the Manhattan skyline. A few simply stood frozen, trying to process how wrong they had been. Preston allowed the silence to settle before speaking again. "There is something else all of you should understand." His voice remained calm, but every person in the room listened carefully. "The most remarkable thing about Corinne is not what she helped build." He glanced toward her with obvious respect. "It is that she never asks for recognition." Several executives nodded immediately. They knew that was true. For years, Corinne had chosen privacy over publicity. While others pursued titles and attention, she preferred meaningful work behind the scenes. Harold Bennett smiled softly. "That has always been her way." Preston laughed. "Yes, it has." He looked back toward the crowd. Many people spend their lives trying to convince others they are important. Corinne has spent hers making other people feel important. The words lingered across the ballroom. No one could argue with them. Audrey slowly stepped forward. Every movement felt difficult now. Hundreds of eyes followed her. The confidence that had defined her earlier had disappeared completely. When she finally stopped a few feet from Corinne, her voice was noticeably quieter. "I owe you an apology." The admission surprised no one. Yet the sincerity behind it did. Audrey took a slow breath. "I judged you before I knew anything about you." Corinne listened without interruption. Audrey continued. "I looked at what I expected to see instead of what was actually in front of me." The ballroom remained silent. Even the event staff stood motionless nearby. For a moment, only the distant sounds of the city could be heard beyond the glass walls. Then Corinne smiled gently. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction, no desire to embarrass anyone. Most people do that sometimes. Audrey lowered her eyes. "That does not make it right." Corinne nodded. "No, it does not." The honesty between them seemed to soften the room. Several guests visibly relaxed. Others appeared reflective. What could have become a moment of humiliation was becoming something entirely different. Preston watched quietly. He understood that this was the real reason Corinne had earned so much respect over the years. Not because of her accomplishments, because of her character. She could have used this moment to expose people. Instead, she was giving them room to learn. Around the ballroom, guests began seeing something larger than the evening's revelation. They were witnessing a lesson about dignity, about assumptions, about the difference between status and worth. And beneath the warm glow of crystal chandeliers while Manhattan sparkled beyond the windows, the room slowly began transforming from a place of judgment into a place of understanding. The mood inside the ballroom continued changing in ways nobody could have predicted when the evening began. Earlier, people had gathered to celebrate success. Now they found themselves reflecting on something far more personal. Conversations resumed slowly, but the tone was different, quieter, more thoughtful. The assumptions that had once seemed so natural suddenly felt uncomfortable. Corinne Whitlock remained near the center of the room, though she clearly had no desire to be the focus of attention. Guests approached one by one. Some introduced themselves properly for the first time. Others offered brief apologies. A few admitted they had witnessed the earlier humiliation and said nothing. Corinne treated every person with the same calm respect. She did not rank people by titles. She did not distinguish between executives and servers. The consistency of her kindness left a deeper impression than any revelation Preston Hale had shared. Nearby, Harold Bennett watched with quiet satisfaction. He had spent decades around powerful people. Most became different when they discovered they held influence. Corinne remained exactly the same. Preston noticed it too. "You know," he said softly as he joined Harold near one of the windows, "this is why she never needed a title." Harold smiled. The title always needed her more than she needed it. Outside, Manhattan glowed beneath the night sky. Reflections from the city lights danced across the glass walls of the ballroom. Inside, the gala program slowly resumed. Award recipients were recognized. Community initiatives were celebrated. Yet even as speakers returned to the stage, attention frequently drifted back toward Corinne. Not because she sought it, because her presence had become the evening's most meaningful lesson. Audrey Kensington remained thoughtful throughout the remainder of the event. More than once, she looked toward Corinne as if still trying to understand how someone treated so unfairly could respond with such grace. Eventually she approached again. This time there was no crowd gathered around them. No tension. No spectacle. Just two women standing near the edge of the ballroom while soft music played in the background. "May I ask you something?" Audrey said quietly. Corinne nodded. "Of course." Audrey hesitated. "Why did you never tell anyone who you were?" The question lingered between them. It was the same question many people in the room wanted answered. Corinne looked out toward the city lights for a moment before responding. "Because I wanted people to meet me before they met my reputation." Audrey considered the answer carefully. Corinne continued. "If respect only exists after someone learns your title, then it was never respect in the first place." The words settled heavily in the silence. Audrey lowered her eyes. She understood exactly what Corinne meant. Earlier that evening, she had seen a stranger and immediately decided where that stranger belonged. She had mistaken confidence for qualification, appearance for truth. Corinne smiled gently. "We all have opportunities to become better than we were yesterday." Audrey looked up. There was no judgment in Corinne's expression. No resentment. Only sincerity. For the first time that night, Audrey smiled back. Across the ballroom, Preston watched the exchange and quietly nodded to himself. The transformation taking place had nothing to do with business. Nothing to do with influence. It was something much rarer. People were learning. Not because they had been forced to. Because they had been shown a better example. And beneath the golden glow of crystal chandeliers while the city shimmered beyond the windows, the evening moved steadily toward its conclusion, carrying with it a lesson that would remain long after the final guest departed. As the evening drew to a close, the ballroom slowly began to empty. The speeches were finished. The awards had been presented. The orchestra packed away its instruments one careful piece at a time. Crystal chandeliers continued glowing overhead, casting warm reflections across the polished marble floor. Through the towering glass walls, Manhattan stretched endlessly into the distance, its lights shimmering beneath the midnight sky. Yet one topic continued appearing in nearly every discussion. Not the company. Not the awards. Not the investments announced throughout the evening. Corinne Whitlock. The woman many had questioned when she first arrived had become the person they would remember most. Thousands of lights stretched across the darkness below. Cars moved through distant streets. Life continued as it always had. Behind her, footsteps approached. She already knew who it was before turning around. Preston Hale stopped beside her and looked out at the city. For a few moments neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable, familiar. "Quite an evening," Preston finally said. Corinne laughed softly. "That is one way to describe it." Preston shook his head. "I am sorry for what happened." Corinne looked back toward the ballroom. Event staff were clearing tables. Guests were saying their final goodbyes. Audrey Kensington stood near the stage speaking quietly with several employees. She looked very different from the woman who had first confronted her. "Something good came from it," Corinne said. Preston glanced toward her. "You always find something good." "Not always." A smile touched her face. "But I try." The owner of Hale Global nodded slowly. That answer sounded exactly like the woman he had known for years. Across the ballroom, Harold Bennett lifted a hand in farewell before disappearing into the crowd. Corinne smiled and waved back. The older man returned the gesture before stepping into an elevator. Another chapter of the evening quietly closed. Eventually the ballroom grew nearly empty. The music was gone. The speeches were over. Only scattered conversations remained beneath the warm chandelier light. Corinne took one last look around the room. Earlier that evening, it had been a place filled with assumptions. People had measured worth by appearance. They had mistaken status for character. They had decided who belonged before learning a single truth. Now the room felt different. Not because the walls had changed. Not because the decorations were gone. Because the people inside had changed. Some only a little. Others profoundly. Preston followed her gaze. "What are you thinking?" Corinne looked toward the city one final time. The reflection of the skyline shimmered across the glass like countless stars. "I am thinking that people reveal themselves long before they realize it." Preston smiled. "And tonight?" Corinne considered the question carefully. Tonight a lot of people learned who they were. The answer lingered between them. Neither felt the need to add anything more. Together they walked toward the ballroom exit. As they reached the doors, Corinne paused briefly and glanced back one final time. The chandeliers glowed softly above the nearly empty room. The marble floor reflected the fading light. The city sparkled beyond the windows exactly as it had when the evening began. Yet everything felt different now. Then she turned and walked forward. Preston beside her. The doors closed quietly behind them. Outside, cool night air drifted through the streets below. The skyline stretched endlessly against the darkness. No applause followed them. No speeches remained. No explanations were necessary. Only the quiet certainty that true worth had never needed an introduction. And beneath the endless lights of Manhattan, that truth remained long after the ballroom had finally fallen silent.